Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Cimino. I'm the Administrative Commissioner from New Jersey, current chair of the commission, and I am going to call the policy board to order. This is going to be episode 1, also known as the board so nice we do it twice. For the policy board members, well, actually, the meeting materials have everything that we all need to see, but for policy board members, Tony sent out a document some time ago where, we kind of realized that some of the stuff in our conservation equivalency policy is not perfectly clear. We are here this morning to kind of get some clarifications, get some guidance. I hope all of you had a chance to read the materials that Tony provided. There are some staff recommendations and quite a few highlights on the things that we need to go over, and that's what we are starting off with this morning. So I'm gonna look for approval of the agenda first. Is there any other additions that folks want to bring forward at this version of policy board? Not seeing any hands. We'll consider the agenda approved. And the proceedings from the February meeting, is there any concern with meeting minutes for that? Not seeing any. Great. Okay. So I will open it up for public comment if there is any public comment to come before policy board. Okay. I see online we have Tom Lilly. Tom, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay, great. Thank you all for this opportunity. On Wednesday, the Menhaden Board will be deciding whether to take action to protect Chesapeake Bay Menhaden. We are asking you, as the conscience of the Commission, to remind the Menhaden Board that Charter Section 6 requires that fisheries resources be allocated fairly and equitably between the states, and this includes Maryland and Virginia. I would like to speak to you about this issue this morning. This past Monday, ocean harvesters began sending 8 purse seine ships into the Virginia Bay that have the capacity to catch every school of menhaden trying to migrate to Maryland to rebuild our forage base for our wildlife. Put in terms of 10-ton schools, they catch 5,000 schools in the Virginia Bay. Isn't it very likely that at least 2,500 of these schools would have made it to Maryland to feed our birds, fish, and other wildlife, but they were caught? Is that treating Maryland fairly and equitably? Isn't Maryland's loss of those 2,500 menhaden schools a year the root cause of the decades-long decline of the Maryland Bay ecology? The last data from Beaufort Lab shows that 70% of the factory catches age 1 and under fish that have not spawned and never will spawn because they've been caught. Thousands of schools of menhaden that would have gone into the ocean to mature and spawn and return to the Maryland Bay year after year, but they never will. Is that fairness and equity to Maryland? Every week the season opening is delayed decreases the unfairness to Maryland and begins to fulfill your charter obligations to treat Maryland fairly. Maryland would be receiving all the menhaden migrating to its bay in the weeks the season is delayed. That is fairness and equity. Maryland protects the menhaden it gets because no factory fishing is allowed. I'm wrapping this up now. Substantially delaying the opening of the season would be a great step forward in reviving the ecology of the Maryland part of Chesapeake Bay. Requiring that they only fish in the U.S. Atlantic zone away from the bay entrance would fulfill your obligation of fairness to Maryland completely. Thank you for your time and attention, and we are hopeful that you will discuss the issues raised in this comment with the Menhaden Board. Thank you very much. Have a great meeting.
You too, Mr. Lilly. Thank you, and I appreciate you staying within that 3 minutes without me even having to say it. With that, unless we see any other hands online, I'm going to look to move on into the review of the CE policy. Okay. All right. I might turn this over to you to start us off, Deb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Joe said, this document was sent out to the board probably in, I don't know, I think it was early March or so, just so everyone had time to chew it over for a little while and think about it some. And I'm just going to quickly go through some of the sort of main discussion points and then pull up the suggested changes that we made from staff. And we just realized that in some cases the document had some errors in it, and so we did some editorial cleanups that I did not mark, and then we did some red line changes and some suggestions based on what we anticipated you all were thinking about with the review of the minutes. And so I just want to make sure that my understanding of what the minutes said were your actual thoughts about how this process should be working. So first is thinking about stock status determination. There was a spot in the document where in the motion when we talked about the use of CE and whether or not it should be allowed after each stock assessment, or was it after just a benchmark, an update, or after the stock status changed. I think it was the intention to have the review of conservation equivalency after each stock assessment, whether it was a benchmark or an update. And even if the stock status changed from the board's minutes discussion, but well, I'll be looking to confirm that. And then the document also talks about adding a new section to the policy to clarify the process to evaluate the use of CE. And this just ensures that reviews are done consistently and provides the boards the information to make informed decisions. And we wrote up a new section for that. We realized after the striped bass stock assessment that we didn't really have a process for that, and we didn't know exactly how you would want us to proceed. So for some suggested changes that we put forward on page 2 of the red line document, the first, and I'm sorry that this is smaller, I was trying to capture the comments as well, but this is in the document that you can follow along with, that's in the meeting materials. The first part is just an error on my part. You all said that there should be no limit on the length of time, and I did not delete that, so I have gotten rid of it. Next slide. The second one talks about just a change in making it clear on the conservation equivalency proposals and whether or not you need to put a proposal in if the measures are more restrictive or not. And we wanted just to clarify that as long as it doesn't have an impact to another measure, single changes to the FMP to be more restrictive do not need to be approved by the management board. But there are times that a single management measure change could have an impact on another measure within the FMP, and so that's why we wanted to add that clarifying language there. And we felt that the qualifier at the end of the paragraph where it says the sentence is thinking about how combined impact is more restrictive. The state has to submit a conservation equivalency proposal, and we just felt like the rest of that sentence really wasn't needed anymore. If someone feels differently, we can put it back in. That was just for readability. And then moving into the questions about the stock status determination, this first part is on page 3. I'm going to jump ahead and then go backwards. So We're looking, as I said before, to confirm that it's each assessment that we are evaluating conservation equivalency. And that would also be changed on page 2. And if you go to the next slide real quick, Madeline, in the second part of this on page 2, that we would add the word each assessment if that is the board's intention. And then Madeline, if you could just pop back to the slide beforehand. So if the board determines that conservation equivalency is not permitted, it would apply to future actions of the board and existing conservation equivalency programs. So I'm trying to determine whether or not a current conservation equivalency program can continue or not. It was my understanding from the board's minutes that those current conservation equivalency programs would have to get would end. The board would determine a timeline in which those conservation equivalency programs that were in existence would end and go back to the standards of the FMP if the board no longer allowed conservation equivalency after a stock assessment. So we added that language, but if that was not the board's intention, then I can remove that language. And then jumping to slide 8. This is the language that was added to the document that gets at the evaluation process for after each stock assessment. And what we're proposing is after the presentation of the stock assessment, staff will bring forward a couple of slides to remind the board of the current conservation equivalency status for the FMP. And what that means is that we'll include whether or not conservation equivalency is allowed, any sector-specific limits or requirements, and then lastly, a list of active conservation equivalency programs. The board then will determine if a change to the conservation equivalency allowance is needed or if additional information is necessary for the board to make that determination. If they need additional information, we would task a TC to provide that additional information to the board at the next meeting. And then if conservation equivalency is no longer permitted under that FMP, the board would have to determine a time frame for those states with existing conservation equivalency programs to adjust their regulations back to the standards of the FMP. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's immediate at that meeting that the state would have to go home and fix everything, but we would just establish a timeline in which those states would come back into the FMP. And then something else that I'm not necessarily saying that this board needs to make decisions on, but something that we realized when evaluating the striped bass measures, because they are the only FMP that actually has existing conservation equivalency restrictions within the plan, is that when FMPs get restrictions, they should be clear about how those restrictions work with this policy and guidance. Right now, I have a series of questions for the striped bass board because it's not clear to staff on how the restrictions of the FMP work with this new guidance. For example, in striped bass, there is an allowance for quota managed species to utilize conservation equivalency. So do we need to evaluate that after every stock assessment? Should we be evaluating allowing other fisheries within the striped bass fishery to have conservation equivalency after each assessment? Is it just straight up, these are the things that can happen and nothing else gets evaluated? So we just will need additional guidance. But as boards allow for restrictions within the FMP, then we also need to be clear about the policy and guidance in this document. And it's not, fault of the striped bass board. They've had those measures in place long before this policy was put in place, but it is just something that we're seeking some clarity on. So we can go back to, I can answer any questions first, and then we'll just go back to the changes that are proposed and see if that is something that the board agrees with or doesn't agree with.
Yeah, it sounds good, Tony. Let's start with questions for Tony, and then I would like to get into a discussion. There was a working group that helped Tony put this document together. Clearly, there are still some questions, and every item that we consider as conservation equivalency in different plans is unique, I think, in some way. And some of those are really evaluated at every compliance report, right? So like New Jersey Striped Bass Bonus Program is considered a CE proposal. We report on, at each compliance report, we report on, how that performed. So there are those evaluations and abilities to raise red flags, but we certainly have some need for clarification here, what happens after assessments. So any questions first? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we'll open it up for discussion on where folks feel this should be going. Is it a clarification or maybe even a pivot, which is certainly acceptable too.
So we can start with the first set of changes, and that first change is, I guess, is there any issue with removing that first sentence where the management boards place a limit on the length of time? I think it's a pretty easy one, but I just want to make sure that was all right. Great. All right.
Okay. Yep. Not seeing any objections.
All right. Fantastic. So then the next one is whether or not it was the intention to have conservation equivalency programs be evaluated after each stock assessment.
Good, we got some hands, and I guess part of the question too is, does it come before the board if there's a red flag for any reason? Does it come before the board if there's a change in stock status? So I saw Jay, and I apologize, I saw some hands down this way, but we'll start with Jason and then Jeff Caitlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was thinking about it, so I think we're on the one, where we're kind of, no, that's okay. So I guess comments for me, I think this is right. I think your interpretation is right. That was our intent. I'll say, like, I don't know that I'll make a comment about that in a minute, but just to kind of think, talk about thinking back to that meeting, there was like a balance we were trying to achieve where people who wanted to be really restrictive and folks who wanted to allow, more flexibility. And I think this was the compromise between the two positions. So that's my recollection. And so I do agree with the comments here that it's supposed to be after, each assessment updated or benchmark or whatever. Thinking about it again, though, maybe I should start by saying I'm not suggesting we change. So I just want to make the comment, we should run the experiment, see how this works. But I also want to have the opportunity to say I told you so maybe at some point in the future. I just think about now every time when we're like in the throes of getting new stock information and trying to figure out if we need to do management, lumping on top of that now a discussion about conservation equivalency. I guess maybe we just need to add in more time to those discussions, because to say it snarkily, they're a piece of cake, those discussions, right? They're quick. But they're challenging for some species, maybe not for others. So like summer flatwood might be like, yeah, we're good. It's allowed, and we sort of move on. I understand those are jointly managed, but just to offer the example on striped bass, it's going to be more of a discussion. So I just in thinking about it, I just think we need to at least map in some more time. But, this has been worked on for a couple of years. I say we move it forward and run the experiment and revisit it if needed. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Jason. And I think I didn't say this in my presentation, but I did write it in the notes that staff had suggested that regardless of the fact that the stock status did or did not change, that the board does evaluate the use of conservation equivalency. And I made that recommendation because you all said you wanted that flexibility. And so if you wanted the flexibility to be able to go back and forth, that additional information that may come with an assessment that still has the same stock status may give you more forethought into how you want to manage that stock. So it provides you that ability to either go back to the old way or change to something new.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I also remember, the idea of a compromise. And I think one of the things that we were trying to avoid was that states would have to constantly be applying, kind of defending why they're doing this and resending in some document. The idea I think behind this was that we can evaluate it, and whether it's a plan review team or a technical committee or the stock assessment subcommittee, and if there is a red flag, bring that before the board, as opposed to constantly defending, more or less. So I had Jeff Kalin and then I believe Erica and Roy.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I seem to remember that there was a lot of support for the idea that CE would only be evaluated if there was a change in stock status. And I don't understand the staff's recommendation that we change that now. It seems to me that, CE has been controversial, but it's also been valuable for states. And it seems kind of pejorative, really, to say, well, we're going to take an opportunity, even if status doesn't change after an assessment, to review the CEs that are in place. I just find that a negative connotation about the use of conservation equivalency. So what's the staff's justification for suggesting that language come out? I'm personally opposed to it.
From the way I interpreted the minutes, the board wanted the flexibility to be able to allow for conservation equivalency, even if the stock status was overfished and overfishing was occurring. And it took that 2/3 majority vote, and you took all the information that was provided in the assessment. And if there was some additional information that you felt okay about, that comes in, and you said, you know what, we actually think CE will be okay because of X, Y, or Z reason, then if the stock status stays overfished and overfishing for multiple assessments in a row, then, and the board wants to constantly be able to evaluate if they want to allow for conservation equivalency through each of those assessments, then you need to be able to do that, regardless of stock status changing. And it also can occur on the flip side. Say a board allows for conservation equivalency, and then the new assessment comes in and some piece of information comes in that tells you, you know what, we allowed for this conservation equivalency to occur, but this new information is telling us some things that we actually don't feel great about that. So we want to turn back on that, but the stock status still hasn't changed. So it seemed to me from the discussion, you all were looking for a lot of flexibility. And in order to have flexibility, then you have to evaluate it after each assessment, regardless if the status changes or not. If you are not looking for that flexibility, then you can pull back that recommendation. But the discussion centered a lot around flexibility. So
it seems to me we're talking about a may versus a shall, and that's why I am opposed to the shall here, which is represented by eliminating that language. I'm only one person, obviously, but I don't see a need to change it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think we share very, very similar sentiments on this. But I do think that, you know, the ability to evaluate is kind of baked into so much of what we do that I don't think it's burdensome, even though I do agree that it is kind of, it seems to be following a notion that it's more dangerous or you know, less risk averse. But at the same time, I think that the ability to do it is there, the technical expertise is there. And if it raises a red flag, then it can come before the board. Appreciate the comments very much. Erica?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I go, are we talking about both sentences here that have been changed?
So it's the sentence on page 2, it adds the word each. And then on page, hold on, I'm just gonna get back. And then on page 3, it does say each, so it's confirming that each is correct.
Okay.
And then, yeah, that's it.
It's a little challenging for me to pull apart my thoughts on the paragraph on page 3. So forgive me if I'm going out of order here. We had kind of a sidebar here. I think it may go along with what some other folks are thinking, that maybe the trigger for reconsidering CE shouldn't be the stock assessment, actually. Maybe it should be when the board considers a management action in response to a stock assessment. And I think that would go along with what you were saying, Tony, of, okay, the status doesn't change, but the board may think perhaps the current regulations for the long-term goal of the stock may not be getting us where we are. So stock status could be consistently positive, but you may evaluate the need to change regulations regardless. So maybe it's when the board considers management action in response to a stock assessment, you would reevaluate, you'd have the opportunity to reevaluate conservation equivalency. And while I have a privilege to speak, going back to page 2, going up a little bit, the paragraph before when conservation equivalency will not be permitted, it talks about adopting a single more restrictive measure. I'd prefer to have more flexibility there because states may consider multiple more conservative measures at the same time, and I think this is too specific. For example, if we consider a bag limit reduction and a vessel limit reduction, we would have to bring that before the board, even though collectively those are both conservative. I'd prefer the opportunity to just do that as my state without having to come before the board to get approval.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to your second one first and then back to your first one, if that's all right. So the rationale for the original group who put this document together in terms of more not being able to automatically do more than one measure is because it is possible to put together 2 measures that as a whole are more restrictive, but individually are not, or the combination of those 2 things can counter each other. And so it can be slightly deceiving on paper of what it does. And so we always have said that if you have more than one measure, that it needs to be evaluated by the TC to make sure it doesn't have any negative consequences. And that's the plain rationale for that, that group has put together, because combining measures sometimes is not as straightforward as it appears to be. And then for your first one, in terms of making the recommendation to evaluate the conservation equivalency when you're doing management measures, I guess it would be a totally different approach to this document than And I'll just say I'm interested to see what the board has to think about that. It's harder at times because then you're making your decision about the management measures themselves and not the stock status. And so it can get more complicated.
Go ahead, Erica.
So going back to my second point, how would I describe to my commissioners if we have conservation equivalency in place and they want to drop a bag limit and a vessel limit at the same time, and I tell them, I'm sorry, commissioners, you can't do that because I need to go ask permission from ASMSC first. How am I supposed to have that conversation?
Yeah, it's a good question, because as a general policy, more restrictive is something that's allowed. I think what Tony is pointing out in the work group, Jay, I think you might remember we had these discussions. There are other elements that you may put together, such as a season, which has its own, reduction estimates, and then adding something to that, which you have to figure out how to evaluate the fact that those two combinations end up in a different place than if it was just one. So I think it may be an evaluation, if we don't see that combination, if that, if the approach was put forward and we didn't see a concern over that, the combination of the two would lessen a reduction. I don't know. I think, I think as a policy, as a general policy, we were hoping that things would come before the board just to make sure that that isn't an element. If folks think that, there's another path forward here, I'd like to hear it. We certainly have had a longstanding policy of you can be more conservative. The general intent here was we just want to make sure everyone's thinking through this. So I'm going to leave Erica's question open to the board in general. Jay?
If this is not what you meant, you can stop me. But so just to respond, I mean, I think it's a good question that Erica raises, and I'm sort of thinking through scenarios in my head as well. But I think in the exact example that she gave, I would, if I were Florida, I would say those are both possession limits. So that's actually only a single measure. And then Joe, exactly what you said, like the problem, why we sort of put this in is it's sort of why we needed the recreational demand model for some of our species. It's because you change one thing, you can kind of calculate the effect. You change two things, you can calculate the effects of those two things, plus there's an interaction between those two things. If you change the minimum, if you raise the minimum size, now the pool of fish that are available is smaller, therefore that's going to impact the effect of your bag limit, things like that. So that's they're like these technical issues that occur when you start to combine different types of measures. But maybe that's something to think about, is like a vessel limit and a bag limit, I think are kind of the same measure. So maybe those types of things that a state could make the case that those are in fact the same, but when you're completely changing the measure itself, that's when, it's just an interpretation of what this document says. Thanks.
No, thank you, Jay. I appreciate that. I fully agree. So, and I think, some of this is about timing. Not every board meets every meeting, and obviously we only meet quarterly. So, Tony, yeah, something to add.
I think the other thing that we try to do when thinking about conservation equivalency is usually states will reach out to us and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this thing. Is that something that I need to run past you, past the board or not? And I think that with the TC chair and staff, we can figure out if that change is something that is truly more restrictive or not. and not have to get too nitty gritty into the details. You know, for example, you know, the striped bass example I'll throw out there, you know, I think I'm going to get it wrong, but someone was thinking to raise their size limit. And we were like, oh, no problem. That's totally more restrictive. Well, in the end, it actually means that they have to lower their quota. And so it wasn't more, or they could have increased their quota. So that's not more restrictive. And so it's not always simple, Simon, when it comes to things. And so, but we figured that out after staff and TC were looking at the measure and said, okay, that's not actually something you can do. This is what you would need to do in order to get that done. So I think that if that communication can occur, it can be something that could easily be resolved.
I mean, ideally that communication would occur, but for those of us who work with commissions, we know that they sometimes have a mind of their own. They may hear something in a meeting and make a final decision in that meeting. And so it's not always possible.
Yeah, I think, well, in a situation like that, I think it goes back to something that Jason said earlier. You're running an experiment and then we're going to see what happens, I guess. And Erica, I think, you know, to your other comment about doing it as a management action to a stock assessment, I think that's a good point. I think, you know, I think it certainly has value if a red flag is raised to be brought before the commission as they're accepting, you know, a peer review or after acceptance of that peer review on if there seems to be an issue with the CE policy that's been in place. But other than that, I don't necessarily know that we need to change the wording. And I say that only because the board's interactions with assessments kind of comes at a point where, you know, we are taking action. So I don't know if we have others. I know I had hands. I know I have Roy and Mike Ruscio, but I will look to hands just if there's anything else on this discussion before we move on to other comments. I saw Doug raise his hand.
Concerning Erica's suggestion of having it tied to us taking a management action, initially I thought, gee, that would be a good thing to have as a clause in there. But as I thought about it more, I think if we did it with each, well, one of the concerns I'd have is that even if staff status didn't change, if we're trying to take we'd have to have some other change that we're going to make via this management action before we would even consider the ability to review the conservation equivalency programs. And there may be a case, and I think it would be a very minor case. I don't think it would happen very often, where we see something that there's an interaction between conservation equivalencies between different states that aren't appropriate anymore because of, you know, either we're going down or we're going up or whatever. So to me, tying it to a management action is saying we got to have some other reason to make a change. And so I'm not sure that's the way to go. And I see this as Tony put up. These are the three things we're going to look at, and 90% of the time we're going to go, no, we're fine with the way things are. It's just looking at it and making sure everybody's thinking about it after every assessment. I don't see that there's going to be wholesale changes even 50%, 75% of the times, or 25% of the times we have an assessment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I agree. And I think, you know, Tony and I were kind of saying the same thing, is that sometimes things move along smoothly And it's unfortunately not as often as we would like, but, and yeah, so, you know, we would be missing the ability to evaluate because maybe no other action was needed. But if there was, again, and it goes back to Jeff Kalin's point, you know, it's not necessarily that there has to be an assumption that this is wrong, but that the evaluation is kind of baked in. I mean, we have the capacity to do it. So if we do it and we see a red flag, have a policy that allows us to bring it to the board, right? Okay. So now, my apologies, Mr. Miller. It's been a while. Well, yeah, and then I'm going to go to Roy, and then I'll go to Mike Ruscio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Every time the subject of conservation equivalency comes up, my mind immediately goes to striped bass. So you could say it's a poster child for conservation equivalency. And I'm thinking back over some of the conservation equivalency measures that we've repeatedly carried forward over the years, beginning in 1990, when we had the first good year class after 10 years of misery, you might say. I'll give you a for instance. Commercial gillnet minimum size limits for striped bass were set in Delaware in 1990, and they've carried forward since then. You mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the New Jersey trophy bonus season. That has carried forward since that era. The Maryland ocean size limit of 24 inches has carried forward. I just want to caution the board, must these long-standing measures, which when they were put in place, they became the new normal. As stocks waxed and waned in response, including those particular conservation measures that were instituted a long time ago. Must we review them every time we have a stock assessment update? That's my point, because I think, well, I agree with what Jeff Kalin said, and I think part of what Eric has said pertains to this same thing is, when must we do this, Mr. Chair? Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Roy, I think that's the prerogative of the board, because if the board doesn't want to have to review them all the time, then all you have to do is put it into the FMP. Once something is part of the FMP, then it becomes part of the FMP and it is no longer a conservation equivalency program. So if the board is comfortable with that plan, then they put it into the FMP and then you're good. But the things that the board are, I would call either thinking about it as an experiment, or your things that you think might work, but you're not sure what the long-term impacts are going to be, then you're going to use a CE for that. And then the next time the plan changes, you have the ability to go forward and put it into the management document. I'll use Maryland's example of what they're trying to do right now. They're trying to re-standardize how they are looking at their fishery. So they are putting it into the FMP in order to do that. And that's a perfectly acceptable path to move forward in making changes, because, you know, there's two things that I think about in conservation equivalency that folks had concerns about. And that was one, that there's not a public process to evaluate what a state is doing. And so you wanted to be able to take it out for public comment and hear what people had to say. And so when you do that, you have the FMP process or the addendum process to get that public comment. And the other part is like thinking more long-term about what the measures, how those measures interact with other management measures that you're utilizing, or how do those measures make it more or less complicated to do a stock assessment. And so the longer you have something in place, then maybe the easier it is to figure out the answers to those questions. It may still keep things complicated, I don't know, but you know, at least you've kind of evaluated that through that addendum and amendment process.
Thanks. Yeah, Roy, I mean, I think, my comments there would go back exactly to what I said to Jeff, is that, well, and the notion that the working group was trying to move past states have to constantly reapply, but the idea, I guess this is going to be a drumbeat of mine right now, but the idea that the evaluations can happen fairly easily with, without burdens to the state necessarily. And if there's a red flag, be brought before the board is hopefully, outside of the fact that when do we have to do this, or how often do we have to do this? I see Adam's hand, so I'm going to go to Mike Ruccio and then Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I've really valued this discussion. A lot of really good points have been raised, lots to consider, but the two things that I really come away with is, in some regards, it feels like we're conflating the complexity of CE and the evaluation of CE with what I think is intended to be more general in this policy. And then we're kind of getting into the details, and that's natural, right? We're trying to wrestle with what does this look like and what are the outcomes, and then we get into the machinations of what CE is, and it's a very complex program, which to me is supporting this concept that yes, we should look at it after a stock assessment. It is very complex. There's a lot of interrelated issues that happen when you start to change or consider change to a measures. I really value the points that have been made that this may not be much of a lift at all, right? But I do think that there is good intent in having that forcing function, having a deliberate check to make sure that what is in place for CE, if there's a new assessment, is still valid, or if people want to change, then it has a process that's kind of baked in. So I think those are all positives. Tony had spoken about the fact that people want to see kind of a transparent process around CE. And so this helps bolster those things, which, as I said, are positives. The other thing that strikes me is, if you look at some of the stock assessments over, whatever span you want to pick here, take a decade, we've had some really interesting outcomes that aren't necessarily a status change, but stock productivity has changed. So the reference points are vastly different than what they had been. And so a stock may be much less productive in some cases, but not be overfished or subject to overfishing. And I think in that instance, you'd certainly want to look and see if your CE program is still configured in a way that's, consistent with what you understand about the stock. We've also had, our tendency is to only think about the negatives and the potential impacts therein. But we've had signal changes in assessments as well, where stocks have done much better than we had expected based on the last look to the new look. In that case, I think you'd want to be able to capture in a program the ability to, again, have that deliberate, thoughtful evaluation. Maybe there's greater opportunity for harvest or changing your CE program to respond to that new information. So just given that assessments, much like CE, are very complex, I would support having it so that the board does take a look, as has been mentioned by others, and I'll reiterate here, that could just be a check the box. Yep, we think everything is good. Or if states want to dig in, then the rest of the language here really supports that the onus is on kind of doing that technical evaluation, coming before the board. I think which are all good things. I understand that does create more process, and it's not lost on me some of the things that Erica and others have said about how difficult and challenging that can be. But I think it's good management practice to kind of have this so that it's clear and people know what to expect. And then there's some accountability for us within the board and the individual species boards too. So thanks. I'm curious to see where we land on this, but do want to try to resist the urge to tinker too much in CE, which I think is kind of separate, and keep this more general and just really the question of, should we do it after each assessment? If we're not going to do it after each assessment, kind of why and what would we do in lieu of that, are really the things that I think we're trying to decide here, but do appreciate the technical references of how complex things get quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. And I think, I very much appreciate you bringing up the notion that it isn't always negative, that, there are times where we're looking at other elements of this. I also think, personally that, the fishing power of one state isn't equivalent to the fishing power of another state. And I think if not allowing CE could be a path where every state is being forced to ratchet down because one or two states have a availability of fish and a level of fishing power that doesn't exist elsewhere. And so I've always seen that as very important. I have two more hands. I'm going to look to Adam and then Bill, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tony to see, we need to kind of wrap this up and make sure that we have this right. So Adam?
I hear Mr. Kalin's concern and his objection to this as written today on the basis of the shall evaluation versus a may evaluate. Sounded like there was some sympathy for that position from yourself, Mr. Chairman. I think Tony did a very good job of expressing the flexibility issue that would arise in allowing, after the stock assessment, for the boards to reconsider the conservation equivalency aspect. I wonder if the way to reconcile those positions is to make two additional changes to this document. The last paragraph on page 2 and the stock status conditions paragraph on page 3, where it says the board will evaluate conservation equivalency programs and will consider if a change in the use of conservation equivalency is necessary on page 3, just changing those words will to may. I think in those instances, it provides the flexibility for a technical committee or someone from the stock assessment to raise a red flag with whatever the current status of conservation equivalency is. Additionally, it gives the flexibility of board members who have a concern about the current status of conservation equivalency to share that concern with others, and ultimately gives the board the flexibility to go ahead and make a change to conservation equivalency with the guidelines of this document without us being forced to do work to do that evaluation when no one really has the desire to do so anyway. So that would be my suggestion based on the conversation I've heard so far.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'm going to go to Bill, and then Bob has some comments, and then I have some thoughts on what you put out. But Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what I believe Mike said previously, so I'm just going to offer a short perspective. In the previous life, when I had to go in and answer to our agency commissioner and answer questions relative to conservation equivalency, they never had to do with what was going on or what some of the options were for our state. It was always to answer the question, how are they getting away with this? How the hell are they getting away with this in some other state? And in that I always felt that being able to answer those questions and to address those concerns by being able to explain a process that was as rigorous and also as structured and as regular as possible was advantageous. So I think this, would have helped in those circumstances. The ability to be able to say there's a policy in place where conservation equivalency is revisited after every stock assessment. So for that simple reason, I like this suggested change. And, I think it's obviously just from previous battle scars that that it could have been helpful at that time.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you're bringing us back to the whole reason why we have a policy, this notion that folks are getting away with something, right? I mean, and not everyone sits at the table for every species, right? So you have a species like striped bass where southern folks sitting across from me luckily get to sit out those fights. But, when you talk about a single coast-wide season or a single coast-wide bag limit, those may be very different impacts. Closing during a certain wave not necessarily getting away with something in some states, but in others, yeah, sure, that's not even a problem, right? So I'm going to go to Bob, and then we'll have Tony bring up the very specific stuff here, and I do have some comments thinking about what Adam said that I think may help us a bit. So Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I just want to go back to the point that Erica made a little while ago about, states being allowed to be more conservative, and that, states being, or I know that's a fundamental underpinning of ASMSC. States should be and always have been allowed to be more conservative. And if the way this is written, after maybe we run the experiment for a little bit, shows that that's becoming more difficult or less efficient for states to be more conservative, I think that triggers bringing this back to the policy board in my mind. I think that's a concern. I think states should have that flexibility. I understand there's some of those scenarios where if you adjust A, it impacts B dimension of your regulations. But if, the example of, if the state wanted to increase a recreational commercial size, increase a commercial size limit, they would be allowed to increase their quota. If that state didn't want to increase that quota, all they wanted to do was change their size limit, then I think that state should be allowed to do that without any complex review by the board or anyone. So I think, maybe, go with this for a while, but if there's something that is getting in the way of states being more conservative or keeping that process very simple as it has been, I think that triggers a review in my mind to come back here and talk about this.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think, that certainly plays in. As Roy pointed out, the New Jersey Striped Bass Bonus Program, he had mentioned that it was a trophy program, and it's actually, we fish on its own allowance for smaller fish, and that reduced the quota, right? So there are those interplays, whereas, as Jay mentioned, you may increase the size limit, but you can increase your quota. You fish on fish that haven't had as much of a chance to spawn, you reduce your spawning potential, and you have those issues. So I'm going to go to, I just want to say to Adam's comments, Adam, I agree with you that when this comes before the board, the idea that it's a may is worthwhile. Like, do we have to talk about it? But I think staff and the folks that are going to be working on this need the guidance to know when. And if it's a may review, that's always a challenge, right? The whole idea, I think, behind the policy is we have something specific. So if we allow that trigger to happen at every assessment, and we put that in this policy, but it only comes before the board if there is a red flag or a concern. I think maybe that addresses what you are bringing up. The board doesn't have to have a discussion about it, but staff needs that guidance to know when it happens. And again, I think really that we have the expertise and things are baked in that those reviews, there aren't a lot of them. Doug was absolutely right. I mean, we're talking about, a very small percentage of times where these issues are even going to be brought before us. So I think that is a concern of staff. So I think having it say that the trigger happens, the review happens, is going to be important. So I'll leave it at that. I'll have Tony bring up the wording, and we'll go through and we'll see if we have any issues or if we can move forward.
I'm going to try the easy way, and then if not, I'm going to need some motions. So I guess, is there objection to the language that the board will evaluate conservation equivalency after each stock assessment? All right, Adam.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I have more concerns about will evaluate creating the possibility of more problems because it's not specific about the depth of that evaluation. Is it just simply we think it's okay? Or is somebody going to make the case for something much deeper and much greater? And I'm far more comfortable hearing the discussion today, myself, with changing those two instances of will to may, and I'm willing to make that motion if that's what's required. So I will make the motion to change the word will to the word may in the last paragraph on page 2, and for the stock status conditions paragraph on page 3.
Dave Sikorsky, second. Okay. So we have a motion and a second.
So I'll just say that for staff, that makes it very difficult to know when to bring conservation, like when to bring back to the board conservation equivalency use or not. Because if it says shall or may, then we don't know after each assessment if we're supposed to bring it to you or not. When are you guys going to tell us if you want it to come back or not? And so the ambiguity there makes it harder for staff to implement the process. I feel, just because the board is going to say after each stock assessment, yes or no to conservation equivalency, it doesn't have to be a detailed piece. You can just say, no, we don't want to do this. But all staff is going to do or if the board agrees with the paragraph below, is after each assessment, you're going to say conservation can be used. It can be used in this way, and here are your CE programs that are out there. And then you make your decision.
My response to that, Tony, is that I don't think it's the staff's job to have to do that. I think the fact that these paragraphs, the sentences in question, begin with the board, it is our responsibility to follow along with what's going on and advise staff whether we want to do that. I would encourage staff to do with each stock assessment presentation exactly what you just said. Here is the current status of conservation equivalency. Okay, go ahead and raise any red flags that came up during the assessment about the impacts of conservation equivalency. And then it's incumbent upon us to do our jobs. I'm not trying to make staffs work harder here, and I appreciate your concerns. So that would be my response to you. I appreciate your we do it all for you board mentality of the entire commission and staff. I'm willing to take it upon the board's shoulders as these paragraphs, these sentences begin, and that's where that onus should lie.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I think you've laid out a case. So if you're okay, I'm going to look to the seconder to see, David, you have any comments? No? Okay. So I'm going to look to discussion on the motion. I saw Jeff Kalin's hand.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just ask Adam, his motion doesn't address the language that has been suggested by staff to be removed relative to stock status review. I think this works very well if that language remains in the paragraph, so that it would be and when the stock status is changed. I'm not in favor of taking that language out, and I think what Adam is suggesting works very well if that language is retained. And I guess that's a question to the maker and the seconder of the motion, if that's their intent, because I do think that works very well to leave that language in about also doing this when the stock status is changed. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think like CE, as you start to put two different elements together, you have combinations that, may have different impacts. So I think that if we are going to take that up, I would take that as a separate motion, actually. Adam, did you have a follow-up to that? Okay.
No, I just wanted to clarify that it was not my intention through the motion on the board to suggest changing any of the changes that staff has already suggested, and that if Mr. Kalin feels strong enough, it would be exactly as you suggest, needs an additional motion.
Okay, all right. So back to discussion on the motion on the board, and I have Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just maybe a comment first, and I'm almost positive when we were working on this, it was May, and we changed it to will. So that may not be true, but I think it might be. It may be true. It may be true. But I guess I feel like this small change, and I don't disagree with anything that Adam said. I totally get what he's trying to achieve. I just think it sort of undoes what I think the intent of this was, which was to put some stronger sideboards on, the approach to conservation equivalency. So I'm like having a hard time with this. I'm not sure if I'm going to support it.
Thanks, Jay. I see Spud's hand. Now, I was Spud's co-chairman here and was so impressed that he got the de minimis and CE policy put through in his time. But here we are, Spud. So you have some comments?
Well, it seems like things never actually get quite done in this business, do they? My question is really more for clarification purposes, I think, to help some of us on this end of the table understand. So when compliance reports are reviewed, to what degree are CE programs reviewed as part of that process? And if they are, is that not sort of an ongoing check on the efficacy of those programs in the context of the existing plan? So I'm just trying to figure out, how do we get to where I think everybody wants to be, but understand if we're already investing some effort in doing that, what is this adding to the process?
So this, to my understanding, what we were doing in this portion of the process is deciding whether or not you're allowing conservation equivalency to carry forward or not. And maybe the language should be worded differently, but this is based off of the motions from before. But it's not actually evaluating each individual state's program, but you're saying you're going to allow conservation equivalency or not in this FMP. If you are not going to allow conservation equivalency in this FMP, then all the existing programs need to go back to the standards of the FMP. So in that sense, and through the process of making the decision, staff brings forward each of the CE programs that are in place. For every compliance report from the newer CE programs, a state has to come and bring information about how that program is working. And you get that in the FMP review each year for striped bass. There are some species, someone texted me in the middle of this, like how many species use CE? We have some species like lobster that has CE in it that we have not been evaluating the use of the CE program because I'm not even sure exactly what all those are. It's going to take a little bit of work on Caitlin's and my part to figure out what those CEs are when the assessment comes forward, because those were from 15 years ago and we didn't have these guidelines where you have to evaluate. So the newer programs, they get done every time. Old ones, not so much.
Okay, we are running a bit late. Adam, you have a follow-up to that? Or?
Yeah, just briefly, so that the record accurately reflects, I just want to make sure, since there are two instances of the word will in the stock status conditions paragraph on page 3, this instance of will applies only to the first instance in that paragraph. Just want to make sure that's completely clear.
Yep. All right. Noted on the record. Appreciate that. We are running a bit late. Is any further discussion before okay, not seeing any hands. Good. All right, so I'm going to call the question here on this motion. Do we need a minute to? Yes, I'm going to give a minute and a half. Just kidding, but hurry up. All right, I still hear some chatter, but I'm going to throw up a hand if you still need some time. If not, I'm going to call the question. Okay, I am not seeing any hands. So Tony will help me here. All of those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Okay, you can put your hands down. Thank you. All of those opposed? Any abstentions? Null votes? So we have 8-7. Okay, we have 8 in favor, 7 opposed. So the motion passes. Mr. Graf?
Given that that's motion passed, I'm wondering if there's a way within this document that we can have the process, at least the first three, the first sentence of the process on the last page included, where we will, the board at each, after each stock assessment, will have the staff remind the board of current conservation equivalency status for the FMP. This will include equivalency is allowed under the, if equivalency is allowed under the FMP, and including any sector specific limits and process, and list as an active conservation equivalency program, any active conservation equivalency. Have that as a staff task that will occur with each assessment, but then the board may determine if any changes are needed, because that's what the board's action is, what I understood Adam's concern was. I'm just looking for that information with each assessment, and the board may consider whether to make any, do any valuation.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I think that's important, right? Because as Tony pointed out, you know, there are some CE, you know, that might have come in and it wasn't even considered CE when it first started, but that's kind of where it falls, because it's outside of what's spelled out in an FMP. So I think that's a great point, and I think we can do that. I don't necessarily think we need a motion. I think it's just part of our, you know, the evaluation that occurs as we move forward, and we have a motion that passed here that, as you pointed out, that we have now determined when it you know, that it may come before the board, but the notion that everyone knows that there's a, you know, that there's some states that are doing something outside of the FMP should always be there for everyone. I appreciate that.
So just for clarity, I was going to come to this section last, but now we'll just go to it now. So is there objection to the language in this new section noting that the will in the board will determine if a change to the conservation equivalency is allowed, will change to a may based on that last vote? But otherwise, is there an issue with this? Does anybody have objection to adding this to the document? Okay, great. So then we'll go back up to page. Oh. So based on the motion that we had just now, we've said that the board may determine if a change to conservation equivalency is needed. So I'm making a change to this paragraph to say may, but the paragraph itself will stay in the document as stay the same otherwise.
Thank you. I just thought you were going to add some of what Doug had said to that text.
Well, that's already, everything that Doug said was already in there.
Okay.
It's already listed.
I guess I didn't see it in there, but I'll take a closer look. Thank you.
Right? Yeah, okay. Like, so then, we'll stay on this page 3 change. Is there objection to adding the language? No, sorry. Is there, where am I? Future actions of the board, where did I get rid of? Sorry, on page 2. Is there objection to striking if the stock status has changed? Seeing no objection to striking that language, we will move forward. Is there objection to adding the language on page 3 that says, as long as it does not have an impact to another measure. And then gives the example. Excellent. Oh, sorry.
So talked about this a little bit earlier, but with that addition, could we not then change the single more restrictive measure to be multiple? Because you have that caveat in there, as long as it does not impact another measure.
No, I think that's a really good question. So there's an evaluation that's taking place since we have the stipulation, as long as it doesn't impact another measure. And then it's determined that it is just more restrictive. Yeah, I mean, I think that works. I guess, do we need additional language is the question.
I think it's fine. I think about a lot of these things as being fine, and then later on I get in trouble. But so based on Erica's suggestion, is there objection to dropping in that very first sentence of the paragraph the word single? Can we delete that? And so that allows the state to do multiple more restrictive measures as long as it does not impact another measure. All right, fantastic. Gone. All right. The last sentence was that we struck in that paragraph due to unexpected consequences. Is there objection to deleting that? That was just readability. Then the next one is the addition on page 3, the first paragraph under stock status condition. If the board determines conservation equivalency is not permitted, it will apply to future actions of the board and existing conservation equivalency programs. Erica. Oh.
So I think here's another case where maybe the work group or staff were thinking about the worst case scenario. So there may be an existing set of regulations that were approved under a conservation equivalency program that would still be appropriate for the stock and the coast-wide efforts to manage that stock. So I want to offer maybe a substitution here to revise it to say, and I won't make a motion yet, I'll let folks talk about it first, but it will apply to future action of the board, period. Additionally, all existing conservation equivalency programs would need to be reevaluated by the board. So that way it's not saying you can continue or you can't, it's just, we'll look at it so that if one state continues to be more conservative in the outcome of the regulations, but it may not match the requirements of the FMP, they're not forced to change, because it is sometimes very challenging for us to get through regulation changes in our state. And if it's really not necessary to achieve conservation, I'd like the opportunity to retain the regulations that exist.
Well, apologies, Eric. We did that last change without a motion, and I think that's fine. I don't know if folks want to see the wording here, kind of do this as a motion. But Tony and I were kind of sidebarring it. I think it does move us a little bit more into a gray area, but I think if we're going to go that route, we need to see the wording on the board. John, and then Lynn.
Can we consider just tabling any more action on this for now? I mean, we're already running a half hour over. We're making changes. I can't evaluate these changes we've made now without seeing the entire finished document. So, I mean, it seems that clearly we're not ready to finalize this document today.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. So, as we pointed out at the very beginning of this, Tony had passed this on to policy board. I think we can do that again and revisit. So I think that's what we'll do. So I appreciate that, John. Tony wants to power through, to be honest with you, but I do think folks probably need to sit with this. So I think we can put forward Eric's wording as an option too. All right, so we got a bunch of hands. So I want to go to Lynn, Eric, back to Erica. Lynn, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't have a lot to add except that with John, I'm beginning to feel a little bit like we're relitigating the conversation that we had. I did not read through the transcripts of our discussions leading into this, and I feel like now is the time. I need a little more time to review the board's logic when we started this, because we're starting to relitigate what we're doing. So that was all. Thanks.
Yeah, and I mean, I do worry, right? I do worry that, as Jay pointed out, as a member of the working group, that there was an intention to put sideboards. And I don't know how far we're going away from that back to almost no policy whatsoever. So Eric, did you have a comment?
Yeah, my comment is I know Tony wants to get this done at this meeting. We're only on part one of the policy board. We could take it up again first thing on our next session, and maybe that'll give people time to analyze what might be the last action we need to take.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll gauge comfort levels in between our episode 1 and 2 of policy board. So we ended up with a cliffhanger, which is how you're supposed to do part 1 of any episode, obviously. Sorry about that. Didn't see that coming. Should have. So yeah, we'll gauge comfort levels on that. We'll get Erica, if you don't mind, we'll get your wording. And do you have follow-up comments?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to ask, and I don't know that if relitigating is the correct term, but as time has passed and more examples have come before the southern states, so we get to see what you all are more familiar with and have dealt with in the past. I've found several things I find problematic within this policy. So what is the best way to bring those before the board? Because I have multiple more points I'd like to have reconsidered in this policy that I don't think we'll get through in this meeting, whether it be today or when we reconvene on Thursday.
Yeah, that's great. I think if you can send those to Tony, and then I think maybe a discussion at policy board is, do we get another working group back together, and do we kind of hammer out some of this? But that I think that was bound to happen, because again, some of the CE things that we consider CE now are so old that they weren't even. That's not how they were proposed, but that's how they have to be considered now, because they're not necessarily part of the FMP. And so I think it's very valuable to kind of reconsider some of this stuff. So I appreciate that. And if you send that to Tony, then we'll have a discussion. We'll add it as an agenda item for how we're going to handle this at policy board part 2. Attack of the clones, I guess, Jay. I don't know.
Eric, if you could just redline what you propose. If you're proposing new language, redline it in the document and then just send it to me. Or if you want a conceptual change, then what that conceptual change is. I'll say that this will make Straight Pass a little harder for Emily and I, but we will carry forward to the best of our ability with the direction that you've given us so far today.
Okay. I do not like to keep Dr. Drew waiting in the wings.
She's right here. She's ready.
Katie, we're going to go to the progress update on ongoing stock assessments.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This will be very quick. This is only an update on species that do not have a meeting this meeting cycle. So you will be getting updates on other species in progress, including lobster, croaker, tautog, menhaden, etc., at their respective board meetings. So this is only an update on weakfish, which unfortunately does not have a board meeting because the assessment has been delayed until the summer meeting. As you all know, we had some delays getting the data together, and then our hope was that we could present it to you at this board meeting, but as we worked with the model, we realized we needed some additional time to basically to update the model for software reasons. So we're still working on that, but are hoping to get it to you by the summer meeting. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take those maybe offline. So thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah. That was, that's your state fish, eh, John? Our long neglected, dear beloved weakfish. But yeah, we look forward to that. I appreciate that. Any questions for Katie? As she said, let's do that offline. I apologize to everyone, but I think that's an easier way to do that. And then we'll move to recess here, and we will be reconvening on Thursday. All right, good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to reconvene Policy Board here. So with that, we're not doing approval of the agenda or proceedings. However, we do have at the front of the table a couple things that we want to take up that are not yet on the agenda. And we will be honestly, oddly sprinkling them in throughout what we have here in our bulleted points. I'm also going to look around the Policy Board to see if anyone else has anything that they need to add under other business. Excellent, that's good to see. Oh, wait a minute, Lynn, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, just real quick, just to talk about some funding issues real quickly. Yep.
Excellent, we'll put that in other business. Tony has something as well, but right now I'm going to turn it over to Dan McKiernan.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a moment and recognize Sarah Ferrara, who is the proxy currently to Representative Jenny Armini. This will be Sarah's last meeting here as a proxy because we're hiring her from the legislative branch over to the executive branch to work at the Division of Marine Fisheries. And I just want to thank her for her service. She's been a great friend and a great performer here and a familiar face to all of you. So thank you, Sarah, for your service to your commission. And congratulations on your new job.
Okay, I'm going to go to Bob Beal.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just one quick introduction of a new staffer that I should have done earlier at the first session of the Policy Board, but I forgot. I want to introduce everyone. I think folks have met Samra Nemaya. She is the new stock assessment person on ASMFC staff. So, you know, she's fitting in great already. And if you haven't met her yet, please go back and introduce yourselves. And she will be around helping us fulfill our pretty lengthy list of stock assessments we need to work on. So just want to make that introduction.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And very exciting. And we all consider ourselves very lucky. With that, I'm going to go into our next agenda item, which is the executive committee report. We had an executive committee session yesterday morning that included a closed session. The first item of business for us was approving the fiscal year 26 budget. That was approved with a report from the Administrative Oversight Committee, which is chaired by our Vice Chair of the Commission, Dan McKiernan. I think we are all aware that we are in uncertain times, but with the approval of this budget, we do feel like we are in pretty good shape. And I think that was, well, I know it's in the meeting materials, so if folks want to take a look at that, they're welcome to do so. And any other questions or thoughts on just that part of it? Okay, good. I'll move on to, we had some legislative updates from Alexander, and this actually included some executive order actions that have been taking place that impact us. If you have any questions on any of that stuff, I absolutely encourage you to speak to Alexander. He's incredibly informed and up to date on everything that's going on that impacts us. We had a brief conversation about how one of the executive orders that has a task for the councils does not include or mention the commission at all. And so from our end of it, being a commission that interacts with 3 different councils, that is something that we're gonna have to take on our own. I'll move on to, we had a discussion on a paper prepared by staff on some issues that have come up on both declared interest and voting privileges. We did not come to a conclusion on where that should go at the executive committee, so we are not quite prepared at this point to present anything to policy board on possible actions. We had some homework that Dan, Bob, and I, and along with staff, are going to work on declared interest, which has been sitting around for a long time. And Bob, if I can put you on the spot, I meant to ask you before this. That is listed in rules and regulations. Okay, great, thank you, appreciate that. So we will be looking at that and be presenting that back to XCOM. XCOM members in general have a homework assignment as well, and that's to look at what exists in voting privileges. But since that will of course come before the full policy board, I would hope that XCOM members work with all of our commission representatives. If there are items that want to be put forward under what we're discussing under voting privileges, that would be much appreciated. Provide that to staff so that we can take this up again at another executive committee meeting. Any questions there? Any further discussion on that before we just, again, get to our homework assignment? Not seeing any. Okay. With that, do we have Kurt here? Yes. Okay. Sorry. Actually, one thing we wanted to do, we did have another item that we were discussing, which is our conservation equivalency policy, and more homework assignments. But so Tony's going to touch briefly on that. It's not something we're going to try and finish off today either. So I'll let her go into that.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Erica for sending me her comments and some red line stuff. I appreciate that. I think what Joe has heard from you all is that folks want time to be able to see the document. And so what I'm going to do is send out a red line version of the document, give you deadlines in which you need to respond, and then we'll bring a new document back to the policy board at the summer meeting. And I'll incorporate, to the best of my ability, the redlined issues that you guys bring up. But I wanted to sort of present some possibilities, I guess, for the existing CE programs as you work on your homework, because I think that there's some fundamental questions that this board needs to answer on existing CEs. And just as a review of sort of what we're saying, I think will happen is that, you know, anytime an assessment is done, the results will be presented. And if the stock is overfished or depleted, the board may choose to allow for CE by 2/3 vote, when otherwise it would not be permitted. At that time, staff will present the use of CE in accordance to the policy. It will also spell out any specific requirements that are in that species FMP. And then then staff will provide a brief overview of the existing CE programs in use. That overview includes information such as the number of years it's been in place, has the program been meeting its intended goals, if the state is collecting and reporting the data per the proposal, and maybe a couple other things. We can sort of work those out, but we don't want to have an extensive report. It's not meant to take hours. And then the board may determine the use of CE is no longer allowed. And then the option, at that time, they have the option to limit CE by sector as well. So it's not like it's yes or no for everything. You could be limiting it by sector. So fundamentally, does the board intend to allow existing CE programs to continue if conservation equivalency is not allowed? And I think that's a question you all need to decide. And in thinking about it with my my work group, is it automatic that conservation equivalency is no longer allowed by default of the policy, and therefore existing CE programs must end and revert back to the FMP standards? Or is the board required to include direction on CE programs in the motion that is allowing for conservation equivalency to occur when the stock is overfished and depleted, or does it not? And then at that time, if you're saying yes to allow existing CE programs, is it all of them, just a blanket yes to all the existing, or are you reviewing each one individually and making a decision for each of those? So I will make sure that these questions are in my red line document and memo, but I think that's sort of fundamentally what you're trying to make your decision on based on what I've heard. But if it's something else, then let me know.
Dan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to bring forward some of the things I heard from colleagues about this issue. One of them is we need a better accounting of what the CEs are, conservation equivalencies, and I talked to staff, ISFMP staff, about this a little bit. And one recommendation I would make is that when there's a conservation equivalency that has been approved and is in force, maybe that could be attached to the back of that specific addendum. So that even though the addendum might have been, approved, let's say, May of 2024, if the conservation equivalency gets approved in a subsequent date, you could have a second date on there. And also have a second accounting of all the conservation equivalencies, because I had forgotten some of them for some of our species that I know are out there, and especially for newer members to the board, they're probably completely oblivious to what some of those are. So I think a better accounting or inventory of the conservation equivalencies would be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I was thinking something similar. I just felt guilty about tasking staff with that, so I'm glad you did. But they are. I mean, and we know that some of these are so long-standing that we have talked about this at, previously, that some of them we're really not thinking about, right? So, and at the very least, I think, Tony, if we could just get a couple examples, up front, eventually with an inventory, but a couple of examples of how complicated it is if states are forced to reverse after 20, 30 years, or what that even means to New Jersey, I think, is a perfect example with our commercial quota. If we would have totally been allowed to harvest all of that commercial quota, but we use a CE program where we use a small portion of it, 20-30%, and we're told we can't do that anymore. That seems pretty odd to me. So something to think about there. So I appreciate that. I'm trying to see if I got through everything. No, I didn't. So still within XCOM, I apologize. Well, we talked about the future annual meetings, Dewey, Delaware, coming up. Jay, you said we have a town, we're in Newport? Yes, so Newport, Rhode Island after that, pretty exciting stuff. We'll go down to South Carolina after that, but I don't believe we have a location yet. And then I mentioned we had a closed session. We talked about litigation that the commission is involved with on lobster trackers and on straight bass for with Maryland. And I would just say that if anyone on policy board has questions on that, please get up with Bob, and he can walk you through some of that. Similarly, we had an update on the CARES repayments. In general, there's been very good progress. We continue to work with NOAA on this, and the states of Florida and New Jersey, along with ISFMP staff, continue to work very hard on that. And I believe that now covers my executive committee report. Okay. With that, we'll move to our law enforcement committee report, and I believe we have Kurt online.
Kurt, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Good afternoon, all. Do you hear me okay?
We can, thanks, Kurt.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Law Enforcement Committee has held 2 meetings since our last report. A virtual meeting held on March 27, 2025, followed by a hybrid meeting during the 2025 spring meeting week. We had the opportunity to welcome Captain David Bailey from the Maryland Natural Resource Police and Captain Jack Chapin from the Massachusetts Environmental Police as new state representatives. Additionally, I'd like to extend my gratitude to NOAA General Counsel Attorney Robert Hogan for his years of support and participation in the LEC. Mr. Hogan has close to 20 years, if not longer, being at our table. He has recently retired, and he's been succeeded on the committee by Mr. Joseph Heckwolf. Next slide, please. I'm not sure if you should, yeah, okay. We had some species discussions during these meetings, specifically the Atlantic Striped Bass Atlantic Striped Bass Addendum 3 on March 27, 2025. The LEC conducted a virtual meeting to address various questions presented by the Striped Bass PDT. The focal point of the discussions was the enforcement of specific management measures under consideration in the development of Draft Addendum 3. A comprehensive meeting summary was provided to the Striped Bass Management Board during the spring meeting, and we look forward to supporting future addendum conversations as it moves through the process. The second species was on the bluefish. Staff briefed the Law Enforcement Committee on the Technical Committee's application of the Risk and Uncertainty tool. The TC is considering using this tool to quantify management uncertainty within the commercial and recreational bluefish fisheries. 2 of the 7 elements of this tool, compliance and enforcement, have enforcement implications and may require the LEC input beyond state compliance reports. The goal of this presentation was to open a dialogue with the LEC and to familiarize the committee with this tool for its future application of fisheries management. Next slide, please. Under other business, Lieutenant Delane Brown presented a case study concerning striped bass enforcement efforts by the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department during summer of 2024. 2 specific cases were highlighted. The first case was the Castile, DeBureau, and Catone case, and the second case was the Travis case. Both cases were presented by the LEC committee in notable cases to this board back at the 82nd annual meeting. Lieutenant Brown provided an in-depth study of the origin, procedures, and penalties associated with these cases. Both incidences involved Massachusetts commercial fishers crossing into New Hampshire state waters and exceeding the permitted limit for taking in or possession of oversized striped bass. Lieutenant Brown shared details of the initial reports of illegal activity, a comprehensive operational plan, and the surveillance techniques employed to apprehend the poachers. The investigation's strengths and weaknesses were discussed as learning tools for other agencies. Lieutenant Brown acknowledged the cooperation and effort of Massachusetts Environmental Police, the Maine Marine Patrol, and several local police agencies in successfully resolving these cases. The penalty phase resulted in a total of 34 warnings being issued, 46 violations cited, amounting to fines totaling $5,478. Additionally, the state of Massachusetts has suspended the commercial permits of these fishers for 3 years. A closed session of our meeting was afforded to openly discuss new and emerging law enforcement issues, as well as providing time for respective agencies to highlight their current enforcement efforts. Next slide, please. Under some notable casework, Connecticut Environmental Conservation Police. On Tuesday, December 17, 2024, 2 NCON officers and K9 Lunar were patrolling the Housatonic River for striped bass poaching activity. Officers encountered a group of 6 anglers fishing. Observations included 1 angler climbing the riverbank, scaling over a guardrail, running across a road, and entering a steep wooded hillside on the opposite side of the road, subsequently disappearing into the woods. The angler was carrying something heavy. After a few minutes, the anglers returned to the riverbank empty-handed and resumed fishing. Upon officers approaching the anglers, it was discovered that 2 individuals did not possess fishing licenses and claimed to have caught no striped bass. K9 Luna was deployed on leash along the roadside and instructed a search of the wooded hillside. She discovered 4 separate bags of striped bass, each buried in the ground and covered with leaves. spanning about a 75-yard stretch of roadside. In total, she recovered 34 striped bass, all ranging in size from 12.5 inches to 25 inches in length, violating the striped bass slot limit of 28 to 31 inches. The anglers were cited for 64 striped bass violations, issuing fines totaling $4,974. All the fish were donated to a nonprofit rehabilitator. Second case I'd like to highlight is out of South Carolina, which was a joint investigation. This is a case from 2023, but the jury, federal jury, just recently convicted a Florida commercial fisherman after a 3-day trial. The fisher was found guilty of making false statements on trip reports about the quantity and quality of fish caught and providing inaccurate information to federal agents. A joint investigation by NOAA OLE, the U.S. Coast Guard, South Carolina DNR Saltwater Team, and the U.S. Department of Justice uncovered evidence of these violations. The fishers managed several commercial fishing vessels, including 2 docked at a federally permitted South Carolina seafood dealer. It was revealed that the manager of these vessels facilitated a scheme where one vessel took an excessive amount of 2 regulated species, transferred this overage to another vessel, and then to a waiting vehicle. The fish was sold to 2 separate dealers to conceal the surplus. In a mandatory trip report filed shortly thereafter, the fisher reported his catch within the limit, concealing the overfishing by the first vessel and attributing a significant amount to the second vessel, which had not caught any fish. When interviewed by NOAA agents, the fisher falsely claimed that the fish had been contaminated by a fuel spill and disposed of in a dumpster. The fisher is awaiting sentencing, but does face a maximum penalty of 5 years in federal prison, a fine up to $250,000, restitution, and 3 years of supervised release following imprisonment. Mr. Chair, this is my report. I'm welcome to any questions and or comments. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kurt. Much appreciated. I do want to note before I open it up to questions that this hotel is pet friendly. So I hope Connecticut gives strong consideration for next year's annual award of excellence. And since we are, I think well ahead of schedule, I'll give a little story about my a college class I had on natural resources law enforcement. It was first day, and our conservation officer told us a story about approaching some anglers on the bank that also took off, caught up to the guys, asked for their fishing license and said they had it. He said, "Then why did you run?" He said, "Because my friends didn't." They managed to get away. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to tell that story. Any questions? I got Lauren.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I really appreciated the report that we just heard, and thank the person speaking about these fascinating cases. It reminded me that for many years, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission has reported both orally and in their magazine cases of boating accidents, some of which were fatalities were involved. And there's a lot of value in receiving those reports because, of course, you would have to analyze your own liabilities if you were caught in a similar situation. I taught boating safety for about 25 years, and on most of those years, I opened the class with an example from one of those fatalities that occurred on Lake Erie, and then questioned the students: what did these boaters do wrong, and what did they do right? That was the whole point of the use of that actual case. And so I really appreciate receiving these kinds of reports because they're not only interesting, but they're also educational for me personally. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lauren. Any other questions for Kurt? Okay, thank you. And again, thank you for the report.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move into other business. I don't know that we had any hands other than Lynn, but I'm going to let Tony go first, Lynn, and then we'll go to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's two things that are CITES related to inform the board about. One is just to let you know that Deb Hahn from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has informed Caitlin and I that they are aware that the EU will be submitting a proposal to list American eel under Appendix 2 for CITES. So as we understand more about that, we will be probably reaching out to the board to either gather additional information or understand better comments that we would want to bring forward. I don't think that the positions have changed too much, but if we do need any additional information, we'll let you all know. The second, Caitlin sent out an email to the administrative commissioners, I believe, because we got an email also from Deb that the IUCN is considering a motion to take hammerhead sharks and move them from an Appendix 2 to an Appendix 1 under CITES. And this is a motion that the IUCN is taking up under their World Conservation Congress meeting, I believe, and that this group has the potential to influence conservation policy both at the species, the site, the national and global level. And so they wanted to better understand how the states feel about this change and how it may impact you all if the hammerheads were to move from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1. And as a reminder to those, Appendix 1 pretty much restricts trade of a species altogether. I think you can get some trade under rare circumstances, but species like gorillas and giant pandas are listed under Appendix 1, if that's helpful for folks to understand. And so what we're trying to figure out from you all is that for those states that do harvest hammerhead, do you know what happens to your sharks? Are they being exported or not, to try to figure out if this would be a substantial negative financial impact to your fisheries or not? Deb has to weigh in on the 12th, which is Monday. And so we are hoping to get information from you by close of business on Friday so that we can compile some information and then provide it to Deb on Monday. And we can take any questions.
Ben?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Questions about the eel. Do they intend to, or do you know at this time they intend to list it? I think last time it was Appendix 2, is that right?
So that's correct, but it's Appendix 2 and it's still the same, and that would, so they'll have to bring up, the proposal will have to be brought forward, it's June, July timeframe, and it'll go to the full conference of parties, which will be in November, December in Uzbekistan.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Tony? Erica?
Tony, I appreciate the early communication on this, and we'll be working to get you our state landings today. I don't know that we'll be able to tell you whether these are shipped internationally or not. In Florida state waters, hammerhead sharks are prohibited from harvest, but HMS does allow their harvest in federal waters. A little bit of a concern here about the way that the CITES process works. Smooth hammerhead their stock is healthy. Scallop hammerhead shows signs that it's been rebuilt and it's healthy, and only great hammerhead is overfished, but it's not undergoing overfishing. And I know there's a concerted effort to try and increase the harvest of sharks for some species or allow more opportunities for harvest. So any measure that would make it more difficult or place burdens on it would be counter to those efforts that are going on. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. And just to be very clear to how I understand it, and Caitlin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's that the IUCN would be requesting and to move them from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1 in CITES. And I think that as a group, as a whole, since they have such influence on other NGOs, it might encourage other NGOs to also make that ask.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Thank you, Tony. If that's all on that, I'm going to go to Lynn, and then Dan has an item as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. People are probably aware of this, but there's been some emails circulating that it does look like the Recreational Fishing and Boating, or Boating and Fishing Foundation is zeroed out at this point. That is Wallet Pro funding, and while they are not directly impacting this body, they are, that's our R3E. Those are the activities that support our license sales, that support our work that we do to keep in compliance with ISFMP. So I just wanted to make people aware. I'm going to get acronyms wrong, but the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is keeping a really tight eye on this. But I just wanted to make everybody aware that it's another piece, and it's just getting one step closer to that sport fish restoration.
Yeah, thanks, and I appreciate that. I think in our discussion at XCOM, and Alexander gave us legislative updates, we had talked about our relationship with AFWA and how we are in a pretty good place right now as far as strong communication. So we will look to him to keep us informed on that, and I'm sure, and of course he will. As I have said during XCOM, he's our award-winning Alexander Law. So. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go to Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to give the board an update of an issue back in Massachusetts. I came to this board, I think about 3 years ago, with some constituent concerns about bonito being targeted and harvested as young of the year, all the way into the Gulf of Maine. I think it's sort of a species shift climate change event, even though it's not a very popular issue to be talking about like that these days, but clearly seeing young of the year bonito in the Gulf of Maine was kind of an eye opener. And so those local groups kept at it with us. And so we went out to public hearing, and we did propose and we did enact some rules. I have up on the board, it's a plot of the weight in pounds, estimated weight from MREP, and you can see the 2024 year was phenomenal. And in fact, this was consistent with what a lot of the anglers and the charter boat captains reported to us, that in the absence of striped bass during the warm summer months and bluefish being down, these so-called hardtails, false albacore and bonito, are really carrying the fishery. And so there was a fair amount of support for our proposals, which was a 16-inch minimum size on both species, as well as a 5 fish limit in aggregate of the 2 species. Now, we all know almost nobody retains false albacore, so it's kind of essentially a 5 fish bonito limit. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and Tina already sent around a state advisory about that action that we took. I think our analysis was showing that Massachusetts was landing about 1/3 of all the bonito on the East Coast on a pretty regular basis, so I just wanted to share that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I have a couple comments myself that I'll just kind of kick us off. These obviously aren't commission managed species, but we have used the commission to kind of help us organize discussions on this, and several states have met several times to have discussions on this. Mass is, moving ahead of other states. I think another example would be Sandlands, and that, kind of an organization and connections through the states that I feel was facilitated by the commission, just in the amount of close work we do together, kind of got some motivation for states to put in regulations on Sandland. So, it's interesting. I think that we have a lot to do here. It's difficult to have discussions on the commission expanding our management realm, and yet we continue to have this close communication that helps in at least sometimes regional decisions that are even outside of the commission. Are there any questions or any discussions on this since, as I mentioned, a bunch of states have been making considerations here? Roy Miller?
Quickly, Mr. Chair, Dan, was that Massachusetts intends to implement that bag limit, or they already have?
We did. It went in effect, I think, this week.
Okay, not seeing any other hands. That's all we have for other business for episode 2 of Policy Board.